Welcome everybody to a new episode with Astrid, your APD, your dietitian with T, no C. And today I have a very special guest, and I really want to make sure this is a great opportunity for us to cover all things plant-based nutrition, and we kind of understand a little bit better why this is important. What are some of the benefits of including more plants, more veggies, more fruit, fiber, all of these beautiful things that have nutrition that we need to just start paying a little bit more attention if we want to live longer and healthier. But now I leave it to my friend, Dr. Matthew. Something that I am so interested in about you is why naturopathic medicine and what attracted you to nutrition specifically?
There's a bit of a story to it. I'll try to break it down, simplify as much as possible. But basically, when I was younger, I struggled with some health issues. I had asthma that at points was quite bad, quite serious. I struggled with allergies, which often goes hand in hand with asthma. I had some skin issues like acne, that sort of thing. Never super bad, but it is certainly bothersome. And I struggled with my weight management despite playing all the sports growing up. I was on every team in school and all of that, but always struggled to maintain my fitness. And I actually had a personal trainer who really promoted more of a sort of plant-based approach, which is maybe a little bit different than a lot of other people's experiences. And being a teenager at the time, I didn't really take him too seriously at first, but eventually I started to kind of give it a go, mostly because he wanted me to do a food diary and give me a little kick in the butt. So I started by shifting a bit more plant-based, certainly eating a lot more fruits and veggies, a lot more smoothies, reducing ultra-processed food intake. So there was a number of different things going on at once. And I started feeling better. My skin was clearer. I was breathing easier. I was dropping some of the weight. And it all happened like pretty quick. Within even a couple weeks, I started to notice some shifts. And that's what initially sparked me to think that, nutrition actually maybe is a little bit more important than I thought at 15 years old. And from then on, I just really tried to learn more and more. At the time, a lot of, blogs and books and things because I wasn't super familiar with the science or how to interpret the science. But then going into university, I took nutrition classes. And eventually, I was deciding on where I wanted to focus my career, whether that was something like medicine or dietetics or what I ultimately ended up going with in naturopathic medicine. And the reason I chose that path is that here in British Columbia, where I practice, we are primary care providers. We're recognized as primary care providers, and I can prescribe most medications. I can, function in that role, but I can also spend a lot of time going over nutrition, and that is certainly a big part of what I do. So I get to, in a sense, practice the best of both worlds. I have patients with hypercholesterolemia where we'll work on nutrition and we'll maybe do some like statin or lipid lowering therapy and just sort of combine the two for best results.
That's amazing. Now, I do have like several questions about a few different things, but I specifically wanted to start understanding a little bit more your sort of like big advocacy for plant-based nutrition and why is so important for you this area specifically?
Yeah, I think there's a few layers there. So again, when I first made the shifts, it was mostly for health reasons, and I wasn't 100% plant-based when I initially started making those shifts. But when I got into university a couple of years later, and I was pretty reliant on cafeteria food, and I'd say my health was maybe, or my diet and health were sliding back maybe in the wrong direction. That's when a switch sort of flipped, and I thought, you know what, I need to go just 100%. I know I can do it, and when I have that hard cutoff, and that's different for everybody, but for me, when I just set that line, I can adhere to it very well. Whereas if I give myself more wiggle room, then there's room to shift maybe further than I want to. And I did really well with that. But then within that first year of eating what would be a strictly or a plant exclusive diet, that's when I actually watched a documentary called Earthlings, which was more so about the food system and what happens to animals, and that is ultimately what drove me to want to maintain it long term. And just to be clear for anyone who's who's looking at that and thinking that there's some like inherent bias to the way I present evidence, I very openly acknowledge that things like fish and like certain dairy products, yogurts, low-fat dairy, those are healthy foods. I just think we can get the same types of benefits from other options, and for ethical reasons, I avoid those foods. So it's not that I'm dissuading people from choosing those foods for health reasons. I don't do that. I like to present the evidence in as balanced a way as I can. It's just my personal choice because of my moral framework that I choose to be 100%.
When you want to decide that, or mostly explain to people the differences between plant-based, vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian, what consensus do we have to specifically know if there is any major difference between this, and would you say that is there one better than the other, or
I
are
see.
they all just equal?
So there's, for starters, let's define those terms. So vegetarian, someone who doesn't eat meat. It's pretty simple. They could eat eggs, they could eat dairy. In some cases, they extend it to fish, but that would technically be what's called like a pescatarian or pesco-vegetarian. And then the broader term plant-based can encompass a lot of things. So some people do use the term interchangeably with like a 100% plant exclusive diet. Um, as far as the scientific literature goes, that is usually referring to a mostly plant-based diet. So that can include 100% as well, but it's usually like Mediterranean, vegetarian, pescatarian. They would all fall under that umbrella of plant-based. And then veganism is actually beyond just a diet. It's a moral framework. It's essentially wanting to extend certain rights to animals, in part being, not killing them for food. And so there's an ethical motive there, which isn't necessarily the case with a lot of these other dietary patterns. But all of them can be similarly healthy. Of course, a vegan diet could be one that is rich in Oreo cookies, potato chips, Coca-Cola. That isn't necessarily healthy, but it's vegan. But if we're talking about a healthier iteration of, say, a vegan diet, fruits, veggies, whole grains, beans, tofu, etc., that can be a very healthy diet that even rivals that of these other healthy diets like vegetarian, Mediterranean. I would say that there isn't clear evidence of one being better than the other. I think they can all be quite healthy. I would say the most evidence we have is for the Mediterranean diet, not necessarily a ton of comparisons between, say, Mediterranean and like a vegan or vegetarian, but that is where we have most research because most studies have gone in that, or I guess it's been studied the longest, and most of the or a lot more dollars have been put into researching that diet just because it's been around for so long.
I think just to become a vegetarian takes potentially a little bit of extra work, because if you want to have a very nutritious, balanced diet, avoid any sort of like risk of deficiencies of certain micronutrients, you really want to plan your nutrition and select the appropriate foods that are going to complement, especially if you want to get adequate amount of protein. And as you rightly said, you could have a vegan diet and be full of crap. Lots of different ultra processed foods that are not animal based, but they are, you could say they're meat free and animal free, but they are still not good quality. So when we think about that specifically, would you say that if someone wanted to transition to a more plant-based diet, maybe not necessarily strictly vegan diet, but more so starting slowly transitioning until a point that maybe they decide to be a vegan, are there skills that you need to develop or have in order to make sure you do get appropriate nutrition from your diet, that you can have an adequate amount of protein intake, energy, and obviously looking at risk of certain minerals and vitamins deficiencies?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, for starters, what I would just lay out is that it's not that it's necessarily, or not that there are necessarily more nutritional concerns, they're different. So there was a really good systematic review. There's actually two of them now by Newfingerl was the last name of the author. I'm probably butchering it, but that's how I would sound it out. And one of them was on adults, and one of them was on children and adolescents. And they looked at studies over the past couple decades evaluating nutritional or dietary intake and nutrient status amongst different diet groups. And they found that those following, say, a vegan diet had certain nutrients that they were sometimes lacking in or needed to focus on, things like vitamin D, vitamin B12, iodine, potentially calcium. But then on the flip side, they tended to get a ton of fiber, magnesium. There were other nutrients that they were doing super well in. If you look at the omnivores on average, they tended to get less folate, vitamin C, lower fiber intakes, actually not even meeting recommendations. But then they had higher intakes of other nutrients, that would sort of flip-flop between the vegan. So there is a learning curve there, but at the end of the day, you're swapping out certain concerns for others. So I do think that there are things that need to be focused on. For one, if you're adopting a vegetarian or vegan diet, B12 is super important. Whether you're supplementing or having multiple servings of fortified foods daily, I suggest supplementing because it's so easy to do that. You can even do a high dose once or twice a week and be covered. Vitamin D is something that, depending, I mean, if you live in a northern climate, I live in Canada, probably a good idea regardless of diet, but particularly if you're not really consuming vitamin D containing foods. Iodine is something that's a concern for most diets, but one that I think sneaks sort of under the radar and maybe doesn't get picked up enough is calcium. I think that is actually something that vegans may need to, or people who avoid dairy in general may need to be cognizant of if they aren't having fortified foods. So, you hear about people saying, oh, I'm making my own almond milk at home or making my own oat milk or what have you. They're probably not fortifying it themselves. And so that's a huge source of calcium that they might be missing out on. And this is something that I see in some of my patients. So I just, tweak a couple things and we get that calcium intake back up. So there are things to learn about, but they're relatively simple. Once you kind of get that knowledge. On the protein side, it really depends on what you're replacing the meat with, right? So if you're replacing meat with rice, well, then yeah, your protein intake is dropping quite a bit. But if you replace meat with tofu, depending on the type of meat and the fat content, it might be somewhat similar, maybe still a little bit less. But if you replace meat with seitan or TVP, you can get the same amount or more protein. You replace eggs with tofu, you actually get more protein. Full fat milk with soy milk, more protein per calorie. So it's more so about replacing those foods with other high protein plant foods. And that is maybe where there's a little bit of a learning curve as well.
I find a little bit of a challenge for certain population and groups, like they have a specific condition, let's say type 2 diabetes, or they have like metabolic syndrome, high risk of developing further conditions because they are obese. Now, switching to a plant-based diet, especially vegetarian diet, sometimes if not well managed and really well understood how to source mainly protein sources, specific protein sources of foods with or without carbohydrates or fats added to it, can be a little bit of a tricky situation with calorie management. As if we're thinking about someone who wants to lose weight, for example, or manage carbohydrate intake, what are some of the recommendations you tend to provide to your patients if we're looking at these tricky situations that, yes, calories are key at the end of the day. We want to make sure that is the biggest thing to create a calorie deficit if you wanted to lose weight or manage your weight. But at the same time, it can be very tricky managing the macro ratios if you want to have a little bit less carbohydrates and higher protein. How do you manage that? What are some of the recommendations you give to your patients in that regards?
Yeah, I try to center meals. So in that case, especially if you're trying to say drop weight and maintain more muscle mass, so like higher protein, in those types of cases, focusing on those more like refined protein sources. So things like TVP. So I actually have them in my pantry back there, and you have these. They're just like soy chunks. It's like defatted soy that's almost pure protein. It's actually a higher protein density than even lean meats. It's very, very high. You can also use things like seitan, where it's pretty much always going to be very high in protein, but the amount of protein to carbohydrates can be manipulated depending on the recipe and how you make it. You can do a bit less flour, more of the wheat protein, or you can use like a chickpea flour in addition to the wheat protein. So that's a really good one. Tofu is often a really good source as well. And so I tend to focus more on those really protein dense foods as sort of centerpieces that the meal can be filled around. There's also some plant-based meat alternatives that can fit into that category quite well. So they tend to be very high in protein. Some are also very high in fat, but you can seek out ones that have less of the added oil and a higher protein ratio. So that's another really good option. And then protein supplements. That's something that I don't think should be shied away from, right? Using a pea-based protein powder or hemp-based or whatever you enjoy. But those are really good ways to get a lot of protein in a small dose.
Big component of like good source of protein quality in a vegetarian diet would be soy-based products. Beyond soy, what other products are available that will provide really good quality protein?
Yeah, seitan absolutely would be near the top of my list. Not suitable for people with gluten issues, so like celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but otherwise phenomenal source. There's also pea-based, it's sort of like a textured soy protein, but textured pea protein that can be a really good one. I actually have some of that as well. I enjoy going between those two. There's actually some really cool soy-free tofu options out there now too that are used things like, say, mung bean or other legumes, really good sources. And then again, going back to protein powders are really good options as well. I actually really like throwing them in even oatmeals. Of course, that would be higher carbohydrate in this case. So maybe depending on macro goals, might not be ideal, but something I enjoy doing to bump up the protein a little bit, or just having it on its own with some water or some plant milk.
With the protein powders, what at the moment in the market, what is the availability of different type of protein powders that are plant-based? I've know that soy is an option, but there's also I've heard about the chickpeas protein powder. But is there anything else that is recently more available, like potato? I think I've heard about the
Yeah.
potato protein powder and other that are really good in high quality protein when isolated as protein powders.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, potato I think has garnered some attention because it has a high leucine content in particular.
Hmm.
Actually, there's a place here in Vancouver that I go to that they have like all the different isolates. They have protein, they have oat, they have everything. Or sorry, the potato, oat, etc. But I would say the ones that are most widely available are pea-based or a pea and rice mix. You get that quite a bit for pea protein, rice protein. Hemp protein is super widely available. I'm seeing fava bean protein more often now as well, used in a lot of products, either mixed with peas or rice or on its own. And then, of course, soy protein being one of the ones out there. But I mean, there's more and more coming out all the time. I know over in the UK, you can get mycoprotein, which is sort of like a mushroom that it's sourced from or similar fungus essentially. But there's just plenty out there. You can kind of isolate it from a lot of different grains and legumes at this point.
What is your stance on the one of the things that I hear a lot about the resistance to go into a plant-based or maybe something that comes up against going into a plant-based is the presence of lectins in veggies, and that could be a source of harm for your health. What is your stance on lectins in plants?
So there's a couple issues there. For one, not all lectins are the same. There's differences between different lectins. For example, the lectins in tomatoes have been shown to have like anti-cancer properties. So if anything, they may be beneficial. I'm not suggesting that eating tomatoes is going to cure cancer, just to be clear for anyone listening. But just the way that these concerns get pushed out there, I think they sort of cherry pick a lot in that sense. The second issue is that when you cook foods, so like the foods with potentially harmful lectins are mostly legumes like kidney beans. When you cook them, you destroy the lectins to points that they're either non-detectable or barely detectable, and at which point they don't harm our health. In fact, those foods improve our health. So what we always have to do is look at the long-term outcome. Like what is the actual end result of consuming that food? Like we can pick out individual things that could theoretically be harmful, But then when we study people consuming them over long periods of time, we see that those who eat more legumes tend to have lower risks of cardiovascular disease, of total mortality. So clearly the food itself is actually beneficial. There's a net positive there. And to sort of paint a picture of why focusing on the outcome is more important, we can look at exercise. So if you exercise, particularly if you're using like a moderate to vigorous intensity, you can raise inflammation for a day or two afterwards. So when you hear that, you can think, oh, exercise is bad for you because it's raising inflammation. But no, at the end of the day, exercise actually lowers your risk of having a heart attack, lowers your risk of premature death, and so on, because that end result is what we care about. And that's why we can't just, cherry pick these little mechanisms or potential mechanisms.
I have a really interesting question that probably I should have asked before asking the lectin question, but for those who don't have an idea what a lectin is,
Okay. Yeah.
how do we actually conceptualize lectins?
Yeah, so they're proteins that are found across. Actually, they're found in animals as well, but they're different forms, different types. But generally, when people mention lectins, they're talking about these proteins that are found across the plant kingdom. Obviously, very concentrated in things like beans and legumes, as I mentioned. And they're involved in a number of different mechanisms, but largely signaling. So they help with producing or breaking down compounds that like send signals throughout the different organisms. So that's like their function. Not that that's all that important for what it does for us, but that's ultimately what they are. Is they're these proteins that are found in these foods.
And they signal what sort of signals? Like, are they just there to protect the plants, or what is the main function of these
So,
proteins?
so that's one of the functions. That's one of the
Okay.
potential functions is protection, but there's a number of them. I actually can't recall all the specifics, but I remember looking into this when I did an episode with Simon Hill. Actually, we talked about it in a little more depth, like a year ago. But it's involved in cell signaling one way or another.
About soy, going back to soy, there's a lot of backlash as to that soy is not a very healthy food and that can create issues with estrogen and like women who has estrogen dominance, or that can get men with like boobs and stuff like that. So why is soy so demonized?
There's a couple sources. So like why this gets spread, I don't know if people truly believe it. I don't know if there's other motives, but I want to focus more on like what is said. And so what the claims that are typically made is that these what are called isoflavones or flavonoids that are in soy, they can have estrogenic effects, or that's the claim. And they are often called or mentioned as phytoestrogens, which is, you can see how the lay person might hear that and get concerned over it. But the reason they are deemed phytoestrogens is because they have some structural similarities to the estrogens we produce, but they aren't the same. They are different. But because they have some of those structural similarities, they can interact with some of the same receptors in our body. The difference is they prefer certain types of receptors over what our own estrogens do, and they don't have as strong of an affinity for those receptors. So they can get crowded out a lot easier. Now, the concerns arise largely from rodent studies where you'll give rodents very large doses of these phytoestrogens in isolation. Sometimes you'll inject them with those phytoestrogens, and they will run into issues. They'll develop breast cancer or other issues. The problem with that is that, for one, we don't consume those doses. Like if we looked at the equivalent dose in humans, it'd be ridiculous, basically impossible. And second, there's actually research on how rodents metabolize these phytoestrogens, and it's different than we do because we aren't rodents. We have different machinery. Um, Now, the second set of studies that tends to provoke some concern are a couple case studies of men who, like one of them developed gynecomastia, so breast tissue growth, and one of them was suffering with erectile dysfunction, if I recall. But they were having like 12, 15, 20 servings of soy a day over the long term. And even then, it's not clear if they ran into these health concerns because of the soy or because they weren't eating anything else, because they were having such a limited dietary intake, or perhaps something unrelated to the diet. It's just not clear. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that it was the soy. I mean, that's a ridiculous amount. Nobody's recommending a soy predominant diet or a soy only diet anyway. If we're recommending it, it's 2, 3, 4 servings a day max. Typically, I would suggest that more is fine, but that's usually where recommendations lie. Now, we actually have meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials in both men and women, like several dozens of these trials. And across the board, we don't see any clear significant or especially clinically significant effects on testosterone or estrogen levels or fertility in the data that we have. And so we can be pretty confident that they don't really affect our hormone signaling. On the plus side, though, especially when it comes to breast cancer, we actually have long-term data on soy consumers and breast cancer risk, and soy actually appears to lower breast cancer risk, not increase it. And that's partially probably because the phytoestrogens actually bind to receptors with anti-estrogenic effects in breast tissue. So it actually diminishes the estrogen effect. So it's actually a positive in that case. So there's just so many misunderstandings around soy, which is ultimately very nutritious and very protein dense.
I want to ask you about egg consumption, because that's another
Okay.
point that I think it comes across as this is one of the reasons why I am stopping being an omnivore and just transitioning more to plant-based, is people coming across of like the saturated fat in meat, eggs, the yolk, and how this could be actually affecting their LDL cholesterol and the total cholesterol levels in the blood. Obviously, we are aware that heart disease is a very important issue and one of the leading causes in mortality at the worldwide. So we know that that is an important key component of to be addressed in our diet. So egg consumption, what is your stance on egg consumption and how much does actually egg consumption affect or increase your cholesterol, total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because there's a number of factors that are at play there. So for one, when it comes to nutrition, the most important questions, in my opinion, are what dose and compared to what. So we always have to look at those two. Now, if anybody claims that like an egg or two a week is problematic, I mean, there's just no real good evidence to back that up in one way or another. But what we see, let's start with the randomized trials on blood lipids. What we see with, say, dietary cholesterol in the yolks or in other animal foods, but obviously the yolks are very concentrated, is that they can raise our LDL cholesterol a bit, but nowhere near as much as saturated fat, which is going to be more rich in things like fatty meats, butter, than those foods. And so it seems to have an effect. However, there's a plateau. So if you take someone who's, say, a vegan, they eat no cholesterol at all, and you add some eggs to their diet, you likely see a larger bump in their cholesterol because they aren't consuming any to start with. If you take, say, the average American who's already probably eating a fair bit of cholesterol and you add some more to their diet, you probably won't see too much of a change because you can only absorb so much cholesterol through the gut. And so that's one factor that really matters. The second thing is there's genetics. So some people are hyperabsorbers, they absorb a lot more cholesterol, others don't really absorb any. And so that can also play a role in how someone responds. The only way to really know is to test your levels, while consuming or without consuming and seeing, if it does change. Or you can test certain genetic markers, but that's really only at specialty labs that like, good luck getting that done. So those are a couple of the factors as far as it affecting lipids. Now, when we look at the outcome data, say cardiovascular disease risk, it really depends on dose. So where we tend to see an increase in risk is around an egg a day average. So there does appear to be an increase in risk of cardiovascular disease around that dose, but again, it depends on what you're comparing it to. So if you look at substitutions of eggs for meat, eggs are actually beneficial. So you replace meat with a roughly equivalent amount of eggs, and the eggs seem to lower risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly if you're replacing red meat. But if you go the other way and you swap plants with eggs, you can actually increase your risk. So it's all on a spectrum. And the sort of take home for me is if you're having a couple eggs a week, not really a big deal. Probably not going to have any meaningful impact. If you're having eggs every day and you were to swap some of those for some plant protein sources, you'd probably lower your risk a bit. If you are having eggs every day, you swap it for meat, you'd probably increase your risk a little bit. So eggs are just sort of in the middle.
I think about meats are not all the same though. When we
Hmm.
think we can have a very, very lean meat like a kangaroo meat, like it's just purely lean meat compared to I don't know, something completely like a ribeye or another type of meat like ground beef that is 90% fat free, but this is still quite a bit of saturated fat in there. If we were to think about the type of meats that you consume, and they were to be mostly lean meats, and in that spectrum, taking out the extra saturated fat or the out layers of
Hmm.
fat, is there any benefit from having some of that in your diet and still add plants
Well, so
versus,
so yeah, so I would
yeah,
say there's still benefit to adding plants in that case, fiber and all of that. Where I think it's where I think we should look though is like where on the spectrum would the meat be at that point? Let's focus on red meat particularly if we were to choose lean. It would be further towards eggs. Maybe it even pass eggs in health value. I don't know exactly where I would say. I don't think we have that exact study, but we do have studies that match saturated fat and fiber and still find plant protein sources to be a bit healthier for heart health anyway than the meat. So we have the Bergeron randomized controlled trial where even when matched for saturated fat and fiber and mono and polyunsaturated fats, or at least closely, the plant protein sources still lowered ApoB a little bit, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And then if we look at substitution analyses like Huang et al. In 2020, and there have been a number of other ones since, even when you adjust for saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, fiber, total calorie intake, diet quality scores, you adjust for all of that, swapping out some animal protein for plant protein still has an effect on mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So I wouldn't say it's risk-free compared to the plant protein sources, but it just depends on what your standard is or what the baseline is. So if the baseline is the plant protein, well, then it would still increase your risk a little bit, not nearly as much. It's a far better option than choosing a really high saturated fat option, 100%.
do you think moving into a plant-based diet with a person already having a background of atherosclerosis or beginning of atherosclerosis, could that be reversed if you
So I
change your
actually
diet?
don't. I don't buy that. So there have been a number of issues with the studies that are typically cited. There's the case series by Esselstyn that's often cited, but there was like one angiogram where apparently the artery opened up, and from what I've heard from people who are say experts in that field, is that that could be due to like the angle the image is taken. Like there are a lot of other explanations for that, and it's a single case. Like I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that. There was also a trial earlier, but the differences weren't really clinically meaningful. For the Ornish trial, actually, if you really dig into the numbers and what changed, it's not so much that the plaque size changed. It was actually that the diameter of the artery might have gotten larger, so the plaque makes up a smaller percentage. Like there's other factors that could explain the results, and even then, it's not really clinically meaningful. Like the only thing I've seen that really leads to clinically meaningful reductions in plaque size are probably like intensive lipid lowering therapies, like medications. But even then, it's not the most important thing in the world. Reducing plaque size isn't necessarily the end goal in all cases. It's reducing your risk of having an event, of having a heart attack. And we see that these plant-based diet interventions do lower your risk of having a heart attack based on the available data. That's the important part. And so that's what I think we should focus on, not so much this. I know it's sexy to say like it reverses the plaque or whatever, but I think we need to stay away from those claims until we have better data. I mean, maybe one day we do have really good data showing that it is in fact the case. Who knows? But as it stands right now, I just don't think it's convincing.
So would you say that atherosclerosis is once it is there is irreversible, pretty much?
For the most part, like I said, there are some intensive like lipid lowering therapies that might reduce plaque volume a little bit, but like you're not having substantial atherosclerosis and cleaning the arteries out. That's just not happening.
I guess you want to develop more additional ramifications of the arteries by exercising more and increasing your physical activity. Do you feel like physical activity would be one of these additional tools that truly impact in a positive way the reduction of event risks of heart disease or even like heart attacks?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's a pretty consistent finding that that physical activity, whether it's resistance or aerobic, I would say we have more evidence for aerobic reducing risk of cardiovascular events. Now, in people with really, substantial coronary artery disease, they might need to be monitored by their doctor and limit the amount of activity as they slowly build that up. So obviously, each person is going to be at their own pace that way, but by and large, yeah, physical activity is quite beneficial.
What is the correlation between meat and cancer? Why is meat so demonized or maybe accused in a way that it is a leading cause of cancer risk?
I don't know that I've seen too many people say it is a leading cause. I mean, it's a risk factor for certain types of cancers, whether we look at, say, colorectal or
Hmm.
other gastrointestinal cancers. I wouldn't extend that to all cancers. And in fact, for other cancers, I mean, processed meat might be more linked to a wider variety of cancers. But I know like one thing that comes up a lot is this Tomorrow Alberta or Alberta Tomorrow project that comes up a lot to sort of exonerate red meat and say that it isn't associated. And I think I think it's oversimplified because so in that study, what people did was, or what the researchers did was they looked at those eating more or less red meat, and then they stratified them into like low, moderate, and high fruit and vegetable intake. And in those eating the highest fruit and vegetable intake, there wasn't a significant increase or statistically significant increase in total cancer risk. Um, the problem with that is, like I said, I don't think red meat necessarily increases risk of all cancers or even majority of cancers. I think there are certain ones like colorectal, and that wouldn't account for that because it's only one of many. The other issue is that the high intake was only like 500 grams a week. It wasn't even a serving a day. And so it comes back to like dose as well, dose and the type of cancer, where we tend to see risk increase around a serving or more per day. And it's not super likely to be modified to a significant degree, at least for like colorectal cancer, based on what we know, um, by eating more fruits and veggies.
I think one of the biggest components that I wanted to address with you as well was oxalates in vegetables, because this is another source of controversy that I hear a lot in social media and a lot of influencers as well, sort of like advocating against plants because the risk of health issues coming from
Mhm.
oxalate. So let's define what an oxalate is and how could this be such a bit of a controversial part of eating plants.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we hear so much out of like the carnivore community. Dave Asprey, I've made like 2 or 3 response videos to him on this. So oxalic acid or oxalates, these are again compounds we find largely in the plant kingdom, particularly concentrated in a few foods, spinach being one of them, beets being another. There's certain types of nuts like almonds are a bit higher. But I would say spinach is always the one that's pointed toward for that. And these oxalates, they can bind to calcium. So one of the claims is that they reduce our calcium absorption. And that might be true to a degree, but the solution there is just not to rely on high oxalate foods for your calcium. Just don't rely on spinach for your calcium, even if it made a significant difference. Like let's just grant that for sake of argument. The other claim that gets brought up is that it can increase kidney stone risk because the calcium and the oxalates can form crystals, which end up being called calcium oxalate stones, and those are a form of kidney stones. And there is some research. If we look at the Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-up Study, we do see that those with the highest oxalate intake, and particularly the highest spinach intake, do have a higher risk of kidney stone development. However, when you only look at those getting higher levels of calcium, that risk diminishes, which is sort of ironic when you think it's like the calcium oxalate stones that are forming. But what happens is the calcium binds to the oxalates, and much like the oxalates prevent calcium from being absorbed, the calcium blocks the oxalates from being absorbed. They both bind together, so you can look at it from either direction. And so it doesn't seem to really be a clear risk factor in people getting enough calcium. And aside from the fact that some people might be prone, if someone gets kidney stones all the time and is very common, then I would limit those really high oxalate foods like the spinach. Choose kale instead, which is really low in oxalates, or just don't eat too many beets, or you can work around it. And usually, as far as I'm aware, nephrologists will work with people and kind of let them know about what the main offenders are.
We have someone with IBS, for example, or IBD, inflammatory bowel disease or syndrome, and they are looking into transitioning to a plant-based diet, vegan diet, or just adding more vegetables in their diet. How can they manage this, especially navigating the higher FODMAP foods, higher fiber intakes, and coming against the bloating, the discomfort, diarrhea, constipation? What are some of your best recommendations when it comes to transitioning into this diet, given the premise that we know that there's an issue that may need to be addressed with their gut?
So there's if someone has like a clinical, a diagnosed IBS, and it's severe enough that it's like bothersome in a day-to-day life, I suggest working with a professional, a dietitian or otherwise to work on like slow integration, perhaps even work on some form of an elimination or low FODMAP diet to hopefully tease out which compounds, which foods are really problematic and sort of limiting those. Now, for someone who, let's say, they want to adopt a more plant-based diet, but they are just they're struggling with a bit of gas and bloating. It's not overly severe, but it's something that is annoying and maybe somewhat bothersome. In those cases, it's all about going slow. So slow introduction of these more fiber-rich foods. That's one of the key takeaways I could give. And it might be comforting to know that we do have some research on like bean intake and like gas production. So one thing you can do to reduce the compounds in the beans, so stachyose, raffinose, and verbascose, these are three carbohydrate like compounds that are in beans that lead to gas production. If you soak beans overnight prior to cooking, you actually remove most of those. So that can be helpful in reducing the gas formation. The next thing that's really important is most people who experience gas from beans, it diminishes or goes away within about 3 months. And in most cases within a month, but for others, it might persist a bit longer, up to say 3 months, with relatively few people still having issues beyond that. So I recommend just a slow introduction over the course of a few months and just slowly build up the doses as your gut microbiome changes a little bit as it gets used to what you're eating.
I wanted to address something around gut health, which I think it is important to also address. So we know that gut health plays such a huge role in all human well-being, but what do you have to say about having a healthy gut bacteria and having more plants in your diet?
Having a greater variety of plants or greater variety of fiber sources does seem to promote a more diverse gut microbiome that would generally be suggested to be a healthier gut microbiome. I would say, however, that the evidence on the gut microbiome and its link to various health outcomes isn't particularly strong at this point. I think we need a lot more research there to really understand what impact it does have and to what degree. But nonetheless, based on our current knowledge and what we would consider to be a healthy microbiome, diversity of plant foods in the diet is certainly a good goal.
When you say diversity of plants, how much?
So there's different numbers thrown out there. The common recommendation based on one study that was done, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago now, is 30 plus plants a week.
Okay. And how much would that look like in terms of like serving sizes? Because yes, I can have 30 plants in just one salad only once a week. Is that enough?
That is actually a really good question. I don't know that they've teased it down to like that sort of granularity. I think it's more so average intake over the week. So that's a really good question that I don't think has been studied, or maybe I'm not aware.
Yeah, because I know that like not everyone likes plants, and sometimes the issue is how to sneak some of these plants into the diet to make it a little bit healthier and richer in nutrients. But also, like, can we get that not just from plants, but like, what about fruit? If you don't like vegetables at all, what is the likelihood to get the same amount of really good nutrition from fruit?
So fruit counts under that umbrella. So
Hmm.
so it would be fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds as being the main five sort of groups that you would look at. So fruits absolutely fit in there. And when it comes to health outcomes, fruit consumption is very consistently associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, mortality around like 2 servings a day, and actually type 2 diabetes risk, which I know is maybe counterintuitive to some people because of the carbohydrate content, but if anything, it lowers risk as well.
Peanuts and protein. This is another very common controversy all the time that I see that a lot of new vegan vegetarians think that getting one of the really good protein sources will come from peanuts or nuts. What is your stance on this, and like how good are peanuts as a source of protein?
Well, they certainly contribute to your protein intake. Like they have some protein, but it's nowhere near what I'd consider a high protein food. Usually, when I'm thinking of highest, like on the low end, I would look at beans or lentils. Lentils in particular, about I think it's 9 grams per 100 calories or something. But then, beyond that, I'd look at the tofu, the TVP, the seitan, et cetera. Those are much higher in protein content per calorie. And so, yeah, the peanuts I would not consider a super high protein food. I wouldn't consider it as a staple as my protein source, but it adds a bit for sure. And actually, something that could be more useful and perhaps considered a higher protein option is actually the peanut butter powders. So the ones where the fat has largely been removed, because then you've basically just got the protein left and you mix it with a bit of water and you get this like low fat, high protein peanut butter. So that might be a good option.
The biggest thing that I wanted to address as well is around actual fiber intake, because there is a lot of resistance from people around, especially like these carnivore and I guess keto communities, that fiber actually makes things worse and make things more complicated. Like if you get the analogy of being in a traffic jam, someone who has constipation and you're adding more fiber, that is just adding more trucks to the road and it's getting things worse and more congested. So why would we add more fiber if we want to get rid of it?
So there's different forms of constipation and different types of fibers. So just generally speaking, when it comes to constipation, we have really good data on viscous fibers like psyllium fiber or psyllium husk, like really good data, dozens of randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials consistently suggesting that it helps with constipation. It's not going to help in every case because, like I said, there are different forms and different causes, but it's one of the options there. It's actually better even for preventing it in the first place. That is often easier than treating it. There's also a little bit of research on, or one study, I should say, that is often cited where people suggest the opposite, where removing fiber was beneficial. And it was a non-controlled trial where they took a bunch of people, told them to remove their fiber, although they didn't completely remove fiber. And they found that those who supposedly removed more fiber were better off than those who didn't. The problem with that study is they actually didn't track their diets, so it's impossible to really know who ate what and how much fiber. But beyond that, those who were worse off at the end were also worse off at the beginning. So they might have just been too far gone to even see any improvements. And lastly, there are some cases where limiting fiber is beneficial in the short term. So there's certain types of, say, inflammatory bowel diseases where during a flare, you might want to limit fiber intake. There are certain formulations like the elemental diet, polymeric diet, et cetera, that might actually help in the short term for relieving that flare. But then when you add fiber back in, you reduce your chance of having another flare. So the fiber is still good in the long term. And so it's just a complete misunderstanding. And I don't know that there's any nutrient that we can point to with more clear, consistent data on health benefits. I mean, if you look at dose responses or these graphs of, say, fiber intake and mortality risk or most other outcomes, it's like a straight line. Just like the more the better, basically, up until the high ends of what people actually consume. So there's no good reason to eliminate fiber other than those few outstanding cases where you do it very temporarily, in my view. And if anything, it's a super beneficial nutrient to include regularly or try to include a lot of regularly.
Do you believe that the supplements outside foods that you would recommend for vegans, vegetarians, or even like in the athlete community that are kind of like must-dos and non-negotiables?
Okay, so the non-negotiable is B12, in my opinion. That is like the non-negotiable, just because there aren't food sources unless you're relying on fortified foods. But like I said, it's just so much easier and convenient to just do a supplement. Um, Beyond that, depending on where you live and sun exposure, vitamin D could be. So like here in Canada, we'll say it's close to a non-negotiable. But in other parts, I mean, you're saying it's cold there in Australia right now. When I think of Australia, I think, oh, you would never need a vitamin D supplement there, but maybe I'm wrong because I haven't been there in a while. But that's one to consider. For the sports community, as you mentioned, I think creatine is a really important one. Again, it's not non-negotiable. You can do fine without it, but if your goal is optimal performance, then yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good idea. Um, Omega-3 as a like an EPA DHA, say an algae-based version, is we'll say a precautionary measure as well. I would like to see more data on vegans who supplement versus those who don't and actual outcomes. Right now, we just have studies on their levels, but I would really like to see that outcome data. But as a precautionary measure, I think it's a good idea. And then potentially iodine or calcium if not consuming iodized salt and not consuming fortified milks. But if you are having fortified milks and you're using the iodized salt, then you don't probably have to worry about those two. So really, at the end of the day, B12 is the absolute non-negotiable, and then the other ones, depending on where you are and what your goals are, might fit in as well. Or just a multivitamin. That makes it really easy, which often I recommend as well.
Would you recommend additional zinc, magnesium, any of those? Or do you think with a relatively thorough, well-planned, plant-based diet is good enough?
So magnesium, absolutely not. Vegans tend to get way more magnesium than omnivores. Like we get tons just from all the different grains and the legumes and greens. So I'm really not worried about that. Actually, nuts as well being good sources. So I'm not worried about that. But with zinc, so zinc's an interesting one. As it stands, there isn't really evidence of zinc deficiency in vegans at higher rates than, say, in omnivores. In fact, there isn't really good data on overt deficiencies, period, for zinc. Um, but vegans do tend to consume less and it has a lower bioavailability. I would put that in that sort of precautionary camp. Like if someone really wasn't eating much in the way of hemp seeds, legumes, pumpkin seeds, and they wanted to just ensure a good source of zinc, then sure, I think a zinc supplement is reasonable. But I would stop short of saying it's a must-have, just because there are ways to get a decent dose through food, like I said, those foods, but it's not clear even how much of a concern it is at this point.
What about pre and probiotics?
So I'm not the biggest on probiotics. I don't think
Hmm.
there's really good data for them in the vast majority of cases. There's very, very isolated cases where there's decent evidence. For prebiotics, I don't know that they're necessary. I think there are cases where they can be beneficial. Like actually, we talked about psyllium. Psyllium is technically a prebiotic. There are cases where these supplements might be beneficial, but not necessarily because of the prebiotic activity. So there might be clinical cases where they're useful, but otherwise, I don't recommend them as like a general advice.
Last one, creatine. Where do you
Mhm.
stand with this one?
Yeah, so actually, I mentioned that as one of the ones for athletes. I think creatine is a good idea for athletes of following any diet, really. If you eat meat, you get a little bit through the meat, of course, and fish. but you're not getting the amounts you would need to saturate your muscles with creatine. So I think creatine is a really good idea for any athletes, and there's some limited data of potential cognitive benefits as well. I would like to see more research there, but as of right now, it's not a bad reason to take it anyway. In fact, it's probably the most studied or one of the most well-studied supplements in the world. Like there's so much data behind it as far as safety as well. So there's very little downside to taking some creatine.
Matthew, it's been a pleasure to have a chat with you and just cover so many questions I had for you. Where can people find you? Is there any new project, anything that you're working on that is coming for you?
Oh yeah, well, thanks for having me again. And I would say I'm most active on Instagram, post little videos a few times a week on different nutrition topics. So you can follow me there or on any of the social medias, YouTube, TikTok, etc. I post across all of those. And as far as projects, I am sort of between projects right now, hopefully getting going on another one very shortly that I can't talk too much about. But the one that I just finished and came out a couple weeks ago was a review paper in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology on plant-based meat alternatives and cardiovascular risk, which has been very well received. It was covered in Men's Health. It was covered on NBC News. It was all over the place, which was really cool to see. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in plant-based meats and kind of learning where they sit on that whole spectrum of heart health.
That's amazing. Matthew, thank you so much for being here today. I am super, super excited that this is going to come out, and we're going to continue expanding some extra facts and really good information about plant-based diet, nutrition. The work that you're doing on this area is amazing. So I think you need to continue advocating for this area and continue to expanding on that research, which is so needed.
Awesome. Thanks for those kind words, definitely, and keep up with what you're doing. I know you're prepping for a competition, or have you done it yet?
Not yet. 8 weeks
Oh,
out.
not yet. Getting there. Okay, well, good luck. Good luck, and keep us posted on that.
Thank you so much. Well, have a great week, and I'll talk to you very soon.